Don't twist that dial. The trouble is not in your set. You are looking at me through the eyes of a drunken driver, and I may be a pedestrian. This may be the way the driver would see that pedestrian. Drinking and driving, they do not mix. What does alcohol do to a driver? Well, it makes the good driver bad, and it makes the bad driver worse. And yet many of us say, oh, it's perfectly all right to take just a little bit. You know, just a tiny bit. The results of alcohol are important in driving, important for you to know. This is what alcohol can do to us as drivers. It can affect some of the very important characteristics that drivers should have, some that we have mentioned. Perception, judgment, coordination, and reaction time. These are some of the things that alcohol affects. It dulls perception. It impairs judgment. It distorts coordination. And it slows reaction time. This is what alcohol can do to you as a driver. Perfectly all right to take just a little bit. He doesn't know. This is one of the problems of alcohol. Most people do not know much about the effects of alcohol on drivers. I have a friend, my friend John, who is one of these good people who just take a little bit, an occasional small drink. But John, like most of you, has ability. You see, alcohol is absorbed directly into the bloodstream. It does not need to be digested. That means it reaches the brain rather rapidly through the bloodstream. And it enters the brain from the outside in, somewhat like a sponge. The alcohol enters from the outside, goes down into the brain. That means that it affects, first, the outermost parts of the brain. And these are the parts that control our power of self-criticism, our power of judgment, many other controls of this kind that are so important to driving. Controls that we cannot afford to lose as drivers, certainly. Alcohol then has that kind of a physiological reaction on it. It slows that reaction time. It dulls these control centers. It also has a psychological reaction. Quite often, alcohol causes the person to develop false confidence. This is extremely dangerous in driving. Overconfidence in their driving ability. Something they would not ordinarily have at all. As we can see here, even John can become overconfident. And along with this, we have a loss of caution and this loss of self-criticism. The loss of caution, think of that, what this will do to you in driving, and the loss of self-criticism. How important they are to us as parts of our driving function. Very important. Now, a good many people consider themselves as social drinkers. Did you ever hear that term? Social drinkers. The person who just drinks to be sociable, just has one or two. However, this same social drinker has this kind of a philosophy about drinking and driving. He believes that the drunks cause all of the accidents. If you ask him, yes, the drunks cause all of the accidents. Not the social drinkers, but the drunks. But even the smallest drink, even that first drink, has a tendency to release your inhibitions, your natural inhibitions, and to relax your moral code. What's that going to mean to you when you're driving? It may mean that you have a little heavier foot than usual on that accelerator. It may mean that you take the right-of-way when you don't have the right-of-way. It may mean that you pull out the pass when ordinarily you wouldn't consider it under the conditions. How important all of these things are in driving. And they may all build up into a kind of a Superman complex. May cause you to have a Superman complex. What can this do to you as a driver? Well, it can put you into trouble very rapidly. Now, of course, people differ in their capacity and their tolerance to alcohol. It has to do with your mental attitude as you drink. It has to do with their physical capacity, the person who is drinking. These are things that vary considerably, and yet we must be dangerous as far as driving is concerned. We believe that even the first small drink can cause a difference in the person's driving ability. Tests have shown that even this small amount can affect their ability to control the car, can affect their ability to see, and we've said that vision is important in driving. It may blur their vision, or it can cause the vision to be narrowed. They do not see to the sides as much as they ordinarily would. And we've mentioned that it can slow reaction time considerably. If reaction time is slowed, of course, a situation such as this may become extremely dangerous. Even the first small drink can alter your will to drive safely. And this is a most important consideration. Now, I think most of you have heard the term being under the influence. Just what is meant by being under the influence? Well, this term actually varies, the meaning of this term, from state to state. But let me read you a general description that applies in most places. If the ability of the driver of an automobile has been lessened in the slightest degree by the use of intoxicating liquors, then the driver is deemed to be under the influence of intoxicating liquor. Now, you notice it said lessen to the slightest degree. Well, let's classify some of these drinking drivers. Let's see just what we mean when we say from the slightest degree to the most degree. First, we have the driver who is down to few. He knows the effects of alcohol, and he tries to compensate for these effects in his driving. Maybe successfully, maybe not. Down to few. Tries to compensate. Then there's the driver who is under the influence, definitely under the influence. There's no compensation here. Some get by, some don't. Another type is the driver that is well under the influence. They do not blend with traffic, and they seldom know what hit them. And finally, the absolute drunken driver, belligerent, stupid, completely oblivious to the traffic about him. Remember, from the beginning to the end of these categories, your driving efficiency is reduced. Now, what is the actual relationship of alcohol to traffic accidents? The relationship is considerable. In Cleveland, Ohio, a study was made, and the study showed this. They took actual blood tests from victims of fatal accidents. And the blood test showed that 54% of the people involved in fatal accidents had been drinking. This is certainly indicative of the place of alcohol in the total traffic accidents. People drink and drive. They're skeptical about it. But in Toronto, Canada, another study was conducted in which the accident car was compared to 4 cars in same type situations, the same kind of car. The comparison showed that 4 to 8 beers or cocktails in 1 hour increased the chances for an accident 3 times. That 8 drinks of whiskey or beer in an hour increased that accident 10 times, that accident chance. You were 10 times more likely to have an accident if you were drinking rather heavily, in other words. Well, what can we do about all of this? One important factor, of course, is enforcement. We must the laws concerning drunken driving. There is tremendous variation in these laws, and in the enforcement of these laws from state to state, in fact, from country to country. Recently in Austria, a drunken driver was fined $1,150. And in one of the Soviet satellite countries, a driver who had been drinking and was involved in a fatal accident was executed. Now, this may be a little drastic. Perhaps we don't want to go this far, but we must have enforcement, and we must have laws concerning drinking and driving. Surveys show that actually this variation is quite tremendous from state to state in this country. We find that in some states, for the first conviction of drunken driving, the penalty is merely the cost of court, a minimum. No fine, no jail, no suspension. In other states, we may find that the license is suspended, and it may be suspended from absolutely no days up to 3 years for the first conviction. In other states, we find that there is a fine for the first offense. The fine may range, again, from nothing to $300. Another part of the enforcement picture, of course, is the jail sentence. And the variation there for the first conviction for drunken driving ranges from 0 to 3 days. So there is a considerable variation from state to state. One of the problems is getting a conviction of drunken driving through the court. The problem here is this. If there's a jury case involved, the jury is usually sympathetic toward the person who is on trial. And remember, when the police arrested this drunken driver, he looked like this. But by the time that he was brought to court, 2 or 3 weeks or perhaps longer later, he looked like an upstanding citizen. He looked entirely different. In fact, he looked something like this. This is one of the reasons that it is difficult to get convictions for drunken driving. And yet, it can be done. One of the ways it can be done is through the use of chemical tests. There are many kinds of chemical tests, and these tests are in use in some part of all the 48 states. We have here one of the types of chemical tests, this one called a breathalyzer. In all of these chemical tests, the alcohol is measured through the breath, the blood, or the urine. In this particular case, we are measuring the breath. In the breathalyzer, the person being tested blows his breath through this tube. We have just had a person who had been drinking blow his breath in here, and we are going to run the test to show you how it operates. We're prepared now to analyze that breath. Let's see how it looks. We find that we have down here in the bottom the breath running through a solution to determine the alcohol content in the breath. Very soon we will test on our gauge here to determine whether alcohol is present or not and to what degree, according to how this indicator will move. Remember one thing about these tests, however, and that is that they help the innocent as well as the guilty, actually. We may prove a person guilty with these, but we also may prove a person innocent with them. People under diabetic coma, for instance, may look very much like they have been drinking, may look like a drunken driver, and yet not have partaken of alcohol in the least. These tests will prove that that person has not been drinking, you see. Now let's look at our test and make the measurement. We find that if we press our button here now, we get a reading. Now we must center through our indicator the small dial here on our gauge. Bring it to the center point. You see it is coming across now. now we have a reading. We're prepared to make our reading and determine just what the alcohol content is in this person's breath. We make our mark here on the small tablet here, remove the indicator, and we have a reading. We find that this individual has about 1,700% alcohol in the breath. For most enforcement agencies, at 1,500, they will be sure to take the person to trial. If he reads somewhere between 5,100 and 15,100, supporting evidence will help to convict that person. But if the individual would read at 1,500 or above, they would believe that the test indicated this person was drunk and would take him to trial on a drunken driving charge. The breathalyzer is one of the many types, then, of chemical tests that can be made, and they are accurate, to determine if the person has been drinking when he has been arrested on a drunken driving charge, and to what extent he has been drinking. Now, of course, we occasionally find that some people refuse to take the test. In one state, they have enacted what they call the Implied Consent Law. It means this, that when the individual gets his driver's license, and that license, by the way, is a privilege and not a right, remember, that he implies consent to take any test to determine his driving ability. Well, of course, these chemical tests are a test to determine driving ability. If he refuses to take this test, then he finds that his license is automatically revoked or suspended. Bearing in mind that the license is a privilege and not a right, we can understand how this law can be put into effect. What else can be done to help as far as drunken driving is concerned? Well, we can make a three-pronged attack on drunken driving. You can make it in your community, or you can see that it is made in your community. We can make this attack through education, through proper legislation, as we've pointed out, and then through enforcement of that legislation. Education, such as we see what we're having right here. Legislation, the chemical test, and maybe a law requiring tests of all drivers involved in traffic accidents. And then enforcement, perhaps fines, suspension, or jail sentences. A three-pronged attack on drunken driving. It can be done. It has been done. In Detroit, Michigan, in 1941, 47 people were killed in drunken driving accidents, and 1,774 injury accidents occurred because the driver had been drinking. Detroit decided to do something about it. They decided on first educating the people that something was going to happen if they would drink and drive, and then secondly, doing something about it. And they did it this way. They put these signs up about town, particularly in the taverns, pointing out that drunk drivers are going to jail. They advertised the fact. And then they did send those drunk drivers to jail. What have been the results of this campaign? Well, since 1946, in any given year, they have never had more than 7 people killed from drunken driving accidents. And their average is about 130 injury accidents per year caused by drunken driving. This represents a 92% reduction. Makes sense, doesn't it? It's certainly worthwhile. Now there's another problem in drinking and driving. It's a smaller problem, and yet it does exist. The problem of the teenager. That unusual teenager, not the average one, but the unusual one, who does drink and drive. What causes this? We know that teenagers actually dislike the taste of alcohol. Well, why do they drink? They drink probably because of social pressure, because of the pressure of their group for them to drink. And yet you see the teenager has an excellent reason for not drinking when he's driving. For the good driver doesn't drink. And how about the girls in the situation, the dates? If you're out with your escort and he drinks, first of all, use your influence. And believe me, you have great influence. Use that influence to stop him from drinking. If you can't stop him, don't ride with him. Call your parents. They'll be glad to pay the taxi fee or to drive over and pick you up, I'm sure. It's a good rule for all of us to remember. Don't ride with a drinking driver. For you as a passenger in the car may be killed just as easily as that driver. And you'll find that some insurance companies will not pay on a policy if you are riding with a drinking driver. They assume that you have taken the risk knowingly. You knew he was drinking, you took the risk of driving with him. Don't ride with a drinking driver. Don't condone drinking in your group. There's another problem, too, that's somewhat like drinking driving, and yet a little bit different. The problem of drugs and driving. Now, we don't mean the drug addict, the person who is actually addicted to drugs. They seldom are in condition to drive. We mean Mr. Average, ordinary, everyday citizen. The kind of drugs that you have in your medicine cabinet, the kind of drugs we see here. The tranquilizers, the sleep resistors, the sleep producers, the antihistaminic drugs. All of these have a very definite effect on driving. And yet, many, many people do not recognize this fact. But they should recognize it, because it is written on the label of all of these bottles. There's a caution written, a caution that tells you that it affects your driving, saying, do not exceed recommended dosage. If drowsiness occurs, do not drive or operate machinery. So you have been warned. You've been warned on the label of the drugs. You've probably been warned by your doctor or your pharmacist. Most of these drugs tend to produce drowsiness. When this happens, of course, you can't do a good job of driving. So remember, if you find it necessary to take these drugs, don't drive. Now let's see what we've said about drinking and driving. We've said that we can control it. We can reduce it. And we can do it through education, through legislation, through enforcement. These are the three-pronged attack. These are the three prongs of the attack. We've shown that it has been done in other places. We know that tests indicate that the person who is drinking, even the smallest amount, has reduced his ability to drive automatically. We must eliminate or reduce these drinking drivers in the traffic pattern. We can do it. Experts indicate that the area of drunken driving is one area in which we could very easily save many lives by having a campaign to control drunken driving. Many, many of these lives that are lost to drivers who have been drinking could be saved. The experts also tell us that approximately 50% of our fatal traffic accidents involve some form of drinking now. 50%. That's a tremendously high figure. What are you going to do about it? Let me read from a clipping that I have that will indicate just what can happen if you don't have a drunken driving campaign in your community. A clipping which says, and I quote directly from the clipping, an automobile driver who swerved head-on into another car on the Cross County Parkway Saturday caused 7 deaths, and it was found he was intoxicated. The medical examiner said laboratory tests showed that his blood contained nearly twice the quantity of alcohol that indicates intoxication. The driver was among the 7 killed. He had been stopped shortly before the accident for speeding, but had been let go. Enforcement. Yes, enforcement is important in our efforts to stop driving and drinking. Well, how about it? Is all of this important to you? Yes, it is. Because that life that may be saved in your community because of a good campaign against drunken driving may be your life. You are the public. Will we have it? It's up to you.